Sound design is an important element of most visual media. It can often enhance or contrast the ideas explored in creative work, and guide an audience through the experience. It's also not something I've seen discussed that much on YouTube, which is the reason I decided to make this video. So how can sound design work alongside an interactive medium? What kind of enhancements can it provide to a video game's characters and themes? In this video I'm going to try and argue that Shadow of the Colossus uses sound design not just to enhance atmosphere, but to actively challenge the player's sense of morality by contrasting player-driven triumph with auditory cues of loss, emptiness and consequence. Shadow of the Colossus is one of the most beloved and discussed video games of all time, because of its morally complex narrative and the many mysteries that surround its world and characters. 20 plus years later, it still inspires theories and conversation between many people who've played it. In this video I'll be exploring how I feel that sound design is used to create and enhance the experience felt during play, and how it helps us to understand the game's characters, themes and events. I'll be using the HD collection bundled with Eco. I feel like this represents a closer look at Team Eco's artistic vision, as well as the higher graphical fidelity that the collection offers. I'd like to also just explain what sound design encompasses in the context of this essay. We'll be exploring how the score is used during pivotal scenes, the use of Foley in the environment, the technical elements of the voice acting and sound in regard to creature and character design. Along with this, I'll be analysing how these elements are used to enhance the storytelling and create emotional engagement in the player. Structurally, we'll be jumping to various points in the narrative, so it's imperative that you've already played it, so we can all be on the same page when it comes to the story and its events. The score created for the game by Ko Otani is one of the best in the business in my opinion. Something I didn't see much during my research is reactions at the time to the style of the score. There are general opinions of it, like saying how enjoyable it is or how it fits the tone, but the presence of an orchestra is something that I think is notable in and of itself. When we think of orchestras in gaming, it's a lot more commonplace now. In fact, I'd argue most big budget games do this to give them a sense of legitimacy, and as a way to match more detailed visuals and bigger and broader storytelling. I'm mostly mentioning this because I think it shows a level of confidence to use it in this game's sound design, and in knowing that the sense of scale that's created with the musical pieces helps give the emotions of the game a big push. I know it's a cliched phrase now when talking about video games, but I would go so far as to say it makes the game feel more cinematic. The compositions also don't just fit the vibe of the game, they also have a wide scope from quieter, more reflective pieces all the way to large bombastic tones, which help to emphasise the emotions of the story, and most importantly, the way they're used is great too. The dynamic way the score navigates these different vibes can create great anxiety and intrigue in the player, and a sense of emotional exhaustion, which is something Wander is likely feeling as well. As a case study, let's look at the Journey 2 and then the confrontation with the first Colossi. The score can sometimes be incredibly melancholic, which helps to muddy the waters of the story and give it a unique energy and vibe. It makes the narrative incredibly emotionally exhausting in the best possible way. The score can also be exciting and energised during the Colossi fights, which reflects how Wander and the player are most likely feeling. But the final blow against them is always punctuated by this incredibly sombre piece of music. It makes you realise you've essentially trespassed onto the land this creature protects and stabbed it to death. As I said, emotionally exhausting. Going from the exciting fight with the exciting music to this sudden shift into sadness is still to this day an incredibly powerful moment for me. It's always going to be more impactful than a story expressed with words because of how universal it is. Big emotional swings taken in this way often leave more of an impact. This is no power fantasy. You're a desperate person being forced into a terrible situation by murdering what is ostensibly an innocent creature for what could be considered a selfish motivation. I mean, we aren't told why Mono was sacrificed, who Wanda is to her, or even whether he may have been involved in her sacrifice. This music also plays as Dorman is sucked into the portal during the final moments of the story. This, along with the scene where Wanda is stabbed through the symbol on his cloak, are meant to highlight the irony of their fates and the fulfillment of the promise Dorman made to Wanda at the beginning of the story, that he would ultimately suffer the consequences of his choice. As I said earlier, the most important thing about the score is not necessarily what it's composed of, no pun intended, but how and where it's used. I think it's important to highlight that most games made during the same period as Shadow of the Colossus often didn't have the same restraint or the confidence to have long periods without some sort of music. The journey through the Forbidden Land when looking for the next Colossus is often incredibly quiet. I'll be talking about the effect and intentions of this in the horseback sections in a later part of this video, but I've brought it up here to show how restrained the audio design often is in Shadow of the Colossus. The score can also be a vital element of the emotional experience of the game. An example of this is during the ending. After Mono wakes up, the score does a lot of the heavy lifting during these moments. There's no dialogue during this ending, so a lot of how we're supposed to feel is dictated by the music. I don't know enough about music theory to comment on why certain notes connect to others and the intended effect. I can only comment on how the score made me feel personally and how it conveyed themes and ideas. But with the little I do know, I appreciate the mixture of minor and modal keys and the changes between them, which give the game a sense of unease and an uncomfortable feeling. It doesn't follow simple progressions, which leaves you unsure about what's coming next, instead of feeling secure and a feeling of safety from the music. I just want to go back for a moment and talk about the music used during the death scenes of the Colossi. Now, as we heard before, the game is going against expectation by having score that sounds melancholy rather than triumphant. This isn't the norm for a video game. Ueda even mentions how it took his staff by surprise in an interview that I'll quote now. As a side note, when I first showed my staff the sequence of sad sound and music being played after defeating a Colossus in Shadow of the Colossus, they thought it was a bug and laughed because they were so used to games that would play a fanfare after defeating a monster. If you want to read more of that interview, I'll leave it in the description below. I mention this interview because I think it's interesting how the intent of Ueda and this score has almost always been to portray Wanda's actions as negative. It's an interesting mix of emotions created by juxtaposing gameplay that feels triumphant to do, with the score actively making you feel a different way about it. This contrast between the player's sense of achievement in gameplay and the mournful tone of the score creates a form of ludonarrative dissonance, where the mechanics encourage one emotional response while the audio actively challenges it. Because the trigger in the score changing is done by player input, it resonates and challenges, which is an interesting thing to feel happening as you play. You're both observer to Wanda and participant in his struggle, which creates both connection and disconnection. I can't say I've ever felt that in any other game I've ever played. To paraphrase something H-Bomber Guy said in his Pathologic video, should games try and explore these sorts of negative experiences in players? It's at least something worth investigating and exploring. This has been done in other games, such as in Snake Eater, where you take control of Big Boss during the moment where you must kill his mentor, the boss. This isn't a cutscene, it's a scene that you cannot progress past until you pull the trigger, which makes the boss's death more heartbreaking. This is a single forced moment though, where Shadow of the Colossus takes that as its entire thesis when it comes to audio design and is structured around it. Now let's move on to the use of language. Shadow of the Colossus is mostly front-loaded with its dialogue, so the objective of the game and its context can be quickly explained to the player. The back end of the game also has dialogue, which is used to explore the consequences of the player's actions. By making the story mostly interactive, it lets the events sit more firmly with the player and lets the effect of those actions have more of an impact. The language spoken in-game is a fictional one, with its roots in a mix of Latin and Japanese spoken backwards. This creates a universal lack of understanding for all players, and a sense that this is a world with its own history and culture, which you are only briefly taking part in. The emotional effect is similar to something like how The Best Is Yet to Come works in Metal Gear Solid. These lyrics are sung in Irish, which makes their interpretation down to the person listening if they don't understand it. This extends to the team who made Metal Gear Solid, which I feel is an interesting creative choice. There are 3 characters in Shadow of the Colossus with speaking roles: Dorman, the character who promises to revive Mono, Wanda, the young man who pledges anything to have Mono brought back to life, and Lord Eamon, a shaman who pursues Wanda to try and stop him from using the forbidden spell, which will resurrect Mono. Lord Eamon's voice is the one we hear in the beginning, which gives us the backstory on the Forbidden Land and helps fill in some of the blanks. Him being the one to supply this information was a good move for 2 reasons. 1, it helps to give this character a presence earlier in the narrative before he appears physically, and secondly, it gives the information he provides a slight bias, which pits him firmly against Dorman. We don't know any more than Wanda regarding the spell in the Forbidden Land, which really helps us to relate to his struggle. Dorman starts off with a male and a female voice. I've often wondered as to the purpose of this, as initially it can be a bit confusing. However, I think I have some theories. Firstly, the mix of these voices could be being done by Dorman on purpose to confuse Wanda. Having this female voice could be a way to subtly coerce him into continuing with his mission, as a subtle reminder of Mono and the voice he longs to hear again. I think this is backed up by the times you can hear a girl's voice in the tunnel transition back to the shrine. Just another way of Dorman tricking him? Or is it a figment of Wanda's imagination as he's slowly broken down by the game's events? I think it's also interesting that this element of Dorman's voice disappears when he's resurrected. He ultimately keeps his promise by reviving Mono, so as I said, he could have been putting that voice on to make sure Wanda succeeded. If we zoom out for a second, I think another potential reason for this choice regarding Dorman's voice is to try and showcase the conflict that is raging inside Wanda. If the female is meant to represent Mono and the goal of helping her, then maybe the male voice could represent Lord Eamon and the warnings he has given to not take this action. Another simpler reason could just be an intimidation factor. Dorman uses this male-only voice when Lord Eamon arrives, so when faced with his enemy, it could just be a scare tactic. More evidence for this is that he doesn't do it with Wanda, someone who's trying to make a bargain with him. Dorman could know that this deal is incredibly one-sided, so he's using this little trick to make Wanda feel more at ease, to lull him into what could be considered a Faustian bargain. As the sword is dropped into the pool, we can also hear Wanda's voice as he's sucked into the portal. This moment really highlights Wanda's vulnerability, and it makes you really feel for him as the transition from Dorman's powerful voice to his pained grunts makes you reflect on the dialogue said earlier about the cost of all this. Next, we're going to talk about the use of Foley and the audio effects used. I think it's important when talking about Foley and the use of audio effects to also discuss some of the elements of the previous game made by Team Ico, which was Ico, and how they influenced the direction of Colossus. For those who don't know, Foley is the reproduction of sound effects that are created during post-production. If Ico and the director, Fumita Ueda, are defined by anything creatively, it's a strict adherence to minimalism, or as he himself named it, design by subtraction. Both games have a strong emotional core that is created by peeling back many unnecessary elements and allowing a player to experience emotions or narrative beats without any sort of excess that will manipulate somebody. For example, Ico is mostly about escorting Yorda through this castle, protecting her by occasionally fighting shadow creatures. Combat is as simple as it can be. There are no combos to perform, and Ico himself can't die in these fights. A fail state is only reached by Yorda being taken. By making the combat simple, It forces the player to not be distracted by the buttons you're pressing or flashy animations, and keeps the focus on the pure emotion of not failing the character you're meant to be protecting. Shadow of the Colossus does things like this too when it comes to sound design. The silence of the Forbidden Land is a great way to force the player to reconcile their actions throughout the game and really think about if what they're doing to the Colossi is justified or moral. By removing something usually considered integral to the experience, like the score, it doesn't let you get distracted from the point of this horseback travel. You're on your way to another intense encounter, and that's all you're likely thinking about. What will this Colossus look like? Will it be bigger, smaller, more aggressive? The game makes you consider this and other questions. It also provides a great contrast to the loud and bombastic fights against the Colossi themselves. The Quiet also highlights the emptiness of the Forbidden Land and gives it a sense of weight. This is a sacred place that you've been told is out of bounds for the people in Wander's village. I also think that by making it stay this quiet, you're also forced to consider your actions in the game, irrespective of morality. You're reducing the amount of life present here, also seen visually by the increasing number of light pillars which represent the dead Colossi. Now the game isn't absolutely silent here. You can hear the wind blowing, the sound of water when you're near lakes and rivers, and the commands that Wander gives to aggro as you ride him. All of these elements help to ground the player in the space and give even the act of just moving from place to place a real sense of weight. It's a lot of ideas and themes you can think about, and it's all thanks to the decision to keep the soundscape in these moments minimal and naturalistic. At this point, it might be helpful to examine the game in action to see what sort of things it's doing using sound and the effect it could have on the player. We're going to use the first Colossus as a small case study here. You're told by Dorman where to go to fight the Colossus, then we have a few minutes of quiet contemplation when riding aggro. This quiet is used for what I mentioned earlier, by letting the player sit with ideas in their head about what they're walking into, and in this early section of the game, whether Dorman can be trusted or not. After climbing up this small cliff, we then have a short cutscene of the creature appearing. The moment you regain control, you sit with just the sound of its large footsteps. This creates a moment of awe as you truly realise what kind of sacrifice Wander is making. Then you get the beast's attention by firing an arrow at it, which then starts the score. It gives you time to assess the situation, and then when you start the fight, the score thunders behind you, as if you're now ready to enact your strategy. After killing the Colossi, Reaver punctuates the impacts on the ground, which feels like another emphasis on your actions. The black tendrils explode out of your victim and then penetrate Wander, with a sound effect that sounds appropriately violent. After returning to the shrine, Wander wakes up and a loud blast of organ music accompanies the statue of the Colossus exploding, which I feel again is constructed to feel like something tragic has happened. This structure is mostly repeated throughout the game with the odd cutscene, used to foreshadow a later event or to re-emphasise the focus on saving Mono. This framework with regards to the sound dynamics is flipped on its head with the final Colossus. For some important context, just before the fight, Aggro, our trusty steed, falls into a valley after saving Wander's life from a crumbling bridge. This is a big emotional moment that has appropriate score, but I think the transition back to silence after is also a good way of letting us sit with the loss. Aggro has been our constant companion throughout the game, and even helped us against a couple of the Colossi, but now we have to soldier on without him. As we get closer to the last Colossus, a loud thunderstorm begins. This is an interesting contrast to the other boss fights, because it's an immediate escalation into danger, rather than what we saw before with a more natural transition into the bombastic score. I think this could represent a few things. The use of thunder and rain in the soundscape could be a representation of Wander's grief for Aggro. It happens right after, and it's the only time in the game that we have weather like this. It could also represent Wander's inner reflection over what's been done over the course of the game. Thunder and rain is quite a visceral noise, and it conjures up harsh emotions, at least for me anyway. Another effect I haven't talked about yet is the vocalizations given to the Colossi themselves. Some of them don't make any sound, but a lot of them make small grunts as they react to your actions. This even goes as far as something I didn't know until making this video. During my research, I saw some people in forums discussing the noises made by the Colossi. A not insignificant amount of people mentioned hearing the 11th Colossi saying the word "why" as it's killed. Now, I can't really hear it if I'm being honest, but I'll play the clip now and let you decide for yourself. if that noise is the Colossus protesting, that, along with the struggling that a lot of these creatures do when you're climbing all over them, would imply a degree of sentience, or even some sort of survival instinct. Contrast to this as well. Avion, the fourth Colossi, does struggle when you're riding on its back, but when you deal the killing blow, it silently seems to accept its fate and falls into the water below it. Colossus number 11 is also the most characterised, and also the one that gets the most kind of backstory from Dorman. We learn that it's the guardian of where it dwells, and you can see when you make your way down to it that it lives in what used to be a lake. It also has webbing on its feet, which implies that at some point this creature lived underwater. Number 11 also showcases a wider range of emotion than the others by being the most aggressive of the Colossus, with it trying to gore you and claw at you, and showing what is obviously fear when brandishing fire towards it, which is the key to defeating it. This is what I was talking about when I mentioned how the game still inspires discussion. An element I didn't notice has made me question everything I thought about what happens in the story, and given it a new twist. A big theme of the game is sacrifice. Mono was sacrificed in a ritual, Wanda sacrifices his body and health in trying to bring her back to life, and now because of these forum posts I saw, it seems like the Colossi we sacrificed in the game could potentially be living beings as well. All of this doubt I now have is because this fictional creature I killed might potentially have asked me why I did it, and that's the real power of this game's sound design. I think all these choices tie into the themes of the game really well. The game is presenting something morally complex, and every aspect of the sound design is holding these ideas together. Finally, what is the conclusion to all of this? So after all that, how is sound design used to enhance environment, character and theme? I think after everything I've said, it's incredibly clear that the specific and curated things done using the sound design help to enhance the experience of playing Shadow of the Colossus, as well as the themes and the environment. The narrative is improved significantly by the space given to the ideas while travelling through the Forbidden Land against a mostly minimalist soundscape. The morality of the actions committed by Wanda, through you, becomes so much more interesting and considered when presented this way. It's almost letting you see it in entirely an objective way. The use of negative sounding score juxtaposed against the gameplay makes this grey morality even more interesting, as you're made to feel bad about your actions, even though games traditionally are generally made to create more positive emotions. The characters are made more interesting by the use of the fictional language and the effects work done on their performances. Just using Dorman as our example, you can see how the dual male and female vocal performances really help to muddy the waters of what you feel while seeing it, and the reverb used on the voices helped give Dorman a real sense of weight and give what is essentially just a couple of voices a presence in the story. As I said in the last section, we can see the effect that the game's sound design has in microcosm when talking about the vocalizations of the Colossi. To paraphrase myself, I reflected more on the game's themes and the choices I was making through the character because a fictional creature I killed in the game asked me why I did it. If that's what actually happened. As I said, I couldn't hear it myself, but the possibility alone makes you really think. The environment is made more tangible by the use of Foley. There's a wide variety of different areas in the game, from cliffs to deserts, inside caves and wide open plains, and they all feel more real than most environments I've gone through in other games because of the sound design work that's gone into it. Unlike film or television, the sound design in Shadow of the Colossus is directly tied to player input, meaning that shifts in music and tone are not simply observed, but triggered by the players themselves, reinforcing a sense of emotional responsibility. I do think it's important to point out some negative things to counter the arguments I've made. I would argue that the emotional effect of the score could be considered manipulative, guiding the player towards a predetermined moral response. However, because these shifts are triggered by player action, the experience does feel earned rather than imposed. In the end, Shadow of the Colossus demonstrates that sound design is not merely an accessory to gameplay, but a fundamental tool for shaping meaning within an interactive medium. Through its restrained use of score, its deliberate silences, and its complex use of fictional language and vocal delivery, the game constructs an experience where the player is not simply told how to feel, but is instead made to confront the emotional weight of their own actions. By contrasting moments of mechanical triumph with auditory cues of loss and melancholy, it reframes victory as something uneasy and morally ambiguous. This is what gives the game its lasting impact. Sound becomes the lens through which the player interprets character, environment and theme. In doing so, Shadow of the Colossus proves that audio in games can go beyond the atmosphere, functioning instead as a powerful narrative force that deepens immersion, challenges player perception, and ultimately transforms play into reflection. There's a broader potential out there. We just need the confidence and vision of Fumito Ueda and Team Ico.